The first thing Carl Fisher heard about America was that it was a place where enemies disappeared. That was what the officers told them during the last winter of the war in Europe, when the sky stayed gray for weeks, and every rumor sounded believable. America, they said, was loud, chaotic, ruthless. A country that smiled while it crushed you. Carl believed them because there was nothing else to believe. So when the steel belly of the transport ship groaned and slowed beneath the rising sun, and a guard shouted something in English he could not understand, Carl felt the same tightening in his chest that every man around him felt. The hold smelled of salt, wool uniforms, and the stale breath of hundreds of tired soldiers. For 2 weeks they had crossed the Atlantic in silence, packed shoulder to shoulder beneath the deck. No one knew exactly where they were going. They only knew the word that passed from bunk to bunk in whispers. America. Someone near the ladder muttered it again now, barely louder than the creak of the ship. America. Carl rubbed his hands together slowly, not because he was cold, but because he needed something to do with them. Around him the other prisoners shifted their weight, boots scraping against the metal floor. The ladder up to the deck rattled as the first group began to climb. One by one they disappeared into the rectangle of white morning light above. Carl watched their shadows stretch and vanish. When his turn came, he grabbed the iron rail and began to climb. The metal felt warm from the sun already rising over the harbor. His legs trembled slightly from weeks at sea. When his head finally rose above the hatch, the light struck his eyes so sharply he had to blink twice before the world came into focus. Norfolk Harbor spread before him like something from another planet. Water glittered in long sheets of gold beneath the early morning sun. Wooden docks stretched out in orderly lines. Cranes stood motionless against the sky like tall mechanical birds. And beyond the harbor, something even stranger waited. Buildings. Entire rows of them. Whole. Intact. Windows unbroken. Roofs untouched by bombs. Carl stepped onto the dock slowly, boots thudding against the wood. The other prisoners were forming a loose line under the watch of American military police. He had expected shouting. He had expected rifles pushed into their backs. Instead, the first thing he noticed was something almost absurd. One of the American guards yawned. Not a theatrical yawn meant to mock them, but the casual yawn of a man who had woken up too early for work. The guard checked his wristwatch, then leaned against a crate as if he were waiting for a train that happened to be late. Carl stared at him for a moment longer than he meant to. This was not how enemies were supposed to behave. A voice beside him whispered in German, "Is this it?" Carl did not answer. He was still watching the guard. The man's uniform was clean, sleeves rolled neatly to the elbow despite the heat already beginning to build along the dock. He looked less like a conqueror and more like a factory worker starting another ordinary morning. Another guard walked down the line carrying a clipboard, stopping in front of each prisoner one at a time. "Name?" he asked in heavily accented German. When Carl's turn came, he answered automatically. "Carl Fisher." The guard made a mark on the paper and nodded once before moving to the next man. That was all. No threats. No interrogation. Just a name written on a list. The line began to move across the dock toward a set of waiting trucks. Carl walked slowly, still absorbing the impossible quiet of the harbor. Gulls drifted above the water, their calls sharp and distant. Somewhere across the street a delivery truck rattled past, the driver honking casually at another vehicle turning the corner. It sounded like an ordinary city morning. It sounded like peace. Carl had not heard a peaceful city in 3 years. When he climbed into the back of the transport truck with the other prisoners, he noticed something else that unsettled him even more. None of the guards were pointing rifles at them. The weapons hung loosely over shoulders, straps resting against uniforms like tools rather than threats. As the truck engine coughed to life and the convoy began rolling away from the harbor, Carl turned his head toward the open side of the truck bed. The streets of Norfolk unfolded around them in wide avenues lined with trees. Storefront windows displayed dresses, radios, and stacks of canned food. A barber swept the sidewalk outside his shop while a woman walked past, carrying 2 grocery bags filled with things Carl could only recognize by shape and color. Apples. Bread. Real bread. The smell drifted faintly through the warm air as the truck passed. Someone behind Carl whispered again, this time with disbelief instead of fear. "Look at the stores." Another prisoner leaned closer to the side rail, staring at the buildings sliding past. "Nothing is damaged." It was true. Every building stood straight and untouched. Not a single roof collapsed. Not a single wall blackened by fire. Carl had grown used to cities where entire blocks vanished overnight. Cities where the sky glowed red from distant fires long after midnight. Here the morning light fell calmly across brick walls and storefront glass. A man in a brown suit stepped out of a cafe and paused for a moment to light a cigarette before walking toward his office, as if the world had never known war. Carl watched him until the truck turned the corner and the man disappeared from sight. Something deep inside Carl shifted quietly then. Not a dramatic revelation, not a sudden change of belief. Just a small crack in the certainty he had carried across the ocean. The convoy rolled through another intersection where a group of American children waited on the sidewalk, holding baseball gloves under their arms. One of the boys noticed the truck full of prisoners and stared for a moment, curious but not frightened. Then he raised his hand and waved. The gesture was so simple that Carl almost missed it. No one in the truck waved back. The prisoners sat frozen, unsure how to respond to something so ordinary. The truck continued forward beneath a sky so blue it seemed unreal after years of gray European winters. Carl leaned slightly closer to the rail, looking out over a country he had been taught to hate since the first day of his training. And for the first time since the ship had appeared on the horizon 2 days earlier, he felt something stronger than fear. Confusion, because nothing he was seeing looked like the America he had been promised. The truck rolled for nearly 30 minutes before the city slowly began to fade behind them, and with every mile the silence inside the truck grew heavier. No one spoke. The prisoners sat shoulder to shoulder on the wooden benches bolted to the sides of the vehicle, their boots resting against the metal floor that vibrated softly beneath them as the engine hummed along the road. Carl Fisher kept his eyes fixed on the passing scenery, trying to understand what he was seeing. The streets gradually widened into long stretches of road lined with tall green trees whose leaves shimmered under the late summer sun. Small houses appeared one after another, each with a porch, each with a small yard trimmed neatly like something from a photograph. In front of many houses stood cars polished until they reflected the sunlight like mirrors. Laundry moved slowly on clotheslines in the warm breeze. It looked like a country untouched by war. A man sitting across from Carl leaned closer to the edge of the truck bed and whispered in German, "Do you see any soldiers?" Carl followed his gaze. The road ahead was clear except for a few civilian vehicles moving calmly in both directions. A pickup truck passed them going the opposite way, its driver lifting 2 fingers from the steering wheel in a casual greeting to the American soldiers driving the convoy. No checkpoints, no rubble, no columns of refugees walking the roads. Just ordinary traffic on a quiet American morning. Carl had expected something else entirely. During the months before his capture, the propaganda briefings had painted a very different picture. America, they had said, was collapsing under the weight of its own excess. Food shortages, riots, desperate cities barely holding themselves together. The enemy was supposed to be chaotic and unstable. Instead, Carl was watching a landscape that looked calm, orderly, almost relaxed. The truck slowed slightly as the convoy approached a railroad crossing. The gates were lowered and a long train passed in front of them with a steady metallic rhythm. Boxcars painted in faded reds and browns clattered across the intersection one after another. Carl counted them without thinking. 10, 15, 20. Freight cars filled with something heavy enough to move the entire train slowly across the tracks. Supplies perhaps. Food. Equipment. He wondered how many trains like this crossed the country every day. A prisoner beside him finally spoke again, his voice barely louder than the sound of the engine. "Look at the grass." It was such a strange thing to notice that Carl almost laughed. But then he saw it. Along both sides of the road stretched wide lawns of deep green grass cut evenly like a carpet. Not the patchy, dusty fields he had grown used to seeing across war-torn Europe. This grass was thick and healthy, watered and cared for. It spread across parks, around schools, and in front of homes where children rode bicycles along the sidewalks. One of the boys pedaling beside the road slowed when he saw the convoy. He stared openly at the truck full of German prisoners, curiosity written across his face. For a moment, he simply watched them roll past. Then he pedaled again, racing alongside the truck for a few seconds before falling behind with a laugh that carried through the air. Carl could not remember the last time he had heard a child laugh without fear somewhere in the background. The convoy eventually turned onto a wider highway where the trucks picked up speed. The wind moved through the open sides of the transport, carrying the smell of warm asphalt, cut grass, and something else that made Carl pause. Food. Real food cooking somewhere nearby. The scent drifted faintly from a roadside diner they passed a moment later. A bright sign above the building read "Breakfast all day" in tall red letters. Through the large windows, Carl saw several men sitting at a counter drinking coffee, while a cook moved behind the grill preparing plates of eggs and bacon. Steam rose from the food in thin white ribbons that caught the morning light. One of the prisoners swallowed quietly. No one said anything. They all smelled it. For months the rations Carl had known were small and practical, designed only to keep soldiers moving. Bread stretched thin with substitutes. Coffee made from roasted grains. Meat when it was available, but rarely enough to fill the stomach. The smell drifting from the diner was different. Rich, warm, abundant. The truck moved past too quickly for the prisoners to keep looking, but the scent lingered in the air long after the building disappeared behind them. Carl shifted slightly on the bench and glanced toward the American soldiers riding in the cab ahead. Their posture remained relaxed. One of them rested his arm casually out the open window while he drove, letting the breeze move through his sleeve. They did not look tense or alert the way soldiers often did near enemy territory. They looked like men performing a routine task at the beginning of an ordinary workday. The convoy continued along the highway for several more miles before turning again, this time onto a road that ran parallel to a wide stretch of farmland. Fields spread out on both sides as far as Carl could see. Rows of crops moved in perfect lines across the soil. A red barn stood near the center of one property, with a tall white silo beside it. In the distance, a farmer drove a tractor slowly across the field, the machine pulling a piece of equipment that turned the earth in long dark rows. The tractor looked enormous compared to the small machines Carl remembered from home. Another prisoner noticed it too. One man, he whispered quietly. One man doing all that work. Carl watched the tractor move steadily across the land. The engine sound carried faintly through the warm air, even from that distance. It was a strange realization, but he could not ignore it. The farm looked efficient, well supplied, productive. Nothing about it suggested the desperation he had been taught to expect. A few minutes later, the convoy slowed again as they approached a small town. Wooden storefronts lined both sides of the main street, their windows bright with signs advertising groceries, clothing, and hardware. A barber pole rotated slowly outside one shop, its red and white stripes spinning in the sunlight. A group of men stood outside a newspaper stand talking casually, while one of them flipped through the morning edition. As the trucks rolled down the street, the men paused to watch the convoy pass. Their expressions were calm, curious perhaps, but not hostile. One of them even nodded slightly toward the prisoners, as if acknowledging their presence without judgment. Carl felt the same quiet crack inside, his certainty widened just a little more. Nothing about the morning made sense according to what he had been told for years. The war still existed somewhere across the ocean. He knew that. But here, along this quiet American road, life seemed to move forward with a calm rhythm that war had not managed to break. And as the convoy left the small town behind and continued deeper into the countryside, Carl began to realize that the greatest shock of all might not be what the Americans did to their prisoners. It might be how ordinary everything else appeared to be. The convoy continued along the country road for another 20 minutes before the trucks finally began to slow. The change was subtle at first, just a gradual easing of the engine as the driver lifted his foot from the accelerator, but every prisoner in the back of the truck noticed it immediately. Heads lifted, shoulders straightened. Even the quiet rhythm of breathing inside the transport seemed to pause for a moment. Carl Fisher leaned slightly forward on the wooden bench and looked past the shoulder of the prisoner beside him. Ahead, the road curved gently between two rows of tall pine trees, whose branches cast long shadows across the pavement. Beyond the trees, something new appeared on the horizon. Fences. Long stretches of wire fencing that ran parallel to the road, supported by evenly spaced wooden posts that seemed to extend for miles in both directions. Behind the fences stood rows of simple buildings painted white beneath wide gray roofs. The structures were arranged with a kind of quiet order, spaced evenly across a large open field. Watchtowers rose above the perimeter at careful intervals, tall enough for a guard to see across the entire compound. Carl had seen camps before. Every soldier had. But something about this place felt different the moment the convoy turned toward the entrance road. There was no smoke rising from chimneys, no shouting carried on the wind, no frantic movement of men rushing from one task to another. Instead, the compound sat quietly beneath the warm American sun, like a small town waiting for the day to begin. The trucks rolled slowly toward a wooden gate, where two American soldiers stood beside a small guard shack. One of them stepped forward as the convoy approached and lifted a hand in greeting to the driver. The gesture looked casual, almost friendly, the way a worker might greet a delivery truck arriving early in the morning. The driver leaned slightly out the window and spoke briefly with the guard while the other soldier opened the gate wide enough for the trucks to pass through. Carl watched the exchange carefully. No tension, no raised voices. Just a few words spoken in calm tones before the convoy moved forward again. As the truck rolled inside the perimeter, Carl noticed something that made him glance twice to be certain he had seen it correctly. A group of German prisoners were already working in the open field near one of the barracks. They wore simple gray uniforms similar to his own, but their movements were steady and unhurried as they carried wooden crates from a supply truck parked nearby. One of the American guards stood close enough to supervise, yet his rifle remained slung loosely across his shoulder. He spoke occasionally, pointing toward a stack of boxes that needed to be moved, but his posture looked more like a supervisor on a farm than a jailer watching criminals. The truck carrying Carl and the other prisoners finally stopped in a wide gravel yard near the center of the compound. The engine rattled once before falling silent. For a moment no one moved. The quiet that followed felt enormous after the steady vibration of the ride. Dust drifted slowly through the warm air behind the truck where the convoy had entered the yard. Carl could hear the faint buzz of insects somewhere in the grass and the distant hum of a generator running behind one of the buildings. The driver climbed out of the cab and walked toward the back of the truck. He lowered the tailgate with a metallic clank that echoed softly across the yard. One of the American military police officers stepped forward and spoke clearly in slow, careful German. "You will step down one at a time." His voice was firm but not harsh. "You will form a line beside the truck." The prisoners obeyed immediately. Years of military discipline moved through the group like an invisible command. Carl waited his turn and then climbed carefully down from the truck bed, his boots crunching against the gravel as he landed. The ground felt solid beneath his feet after the long journey. He straightened his back and joined the line forming beside the vehicle. The American officer walked slowly along the row of prisoners, checking each face as if memorizing them. He carried a clipboard under one arm and occasionally glanced down to compare the men in front of him with the names written on the page. When he reached Carl, he paused briefly. "Carl Fischer," he read aloud. Carl nodded once. The officer made a small mark beside the name and moved on. That was all. No interrogation. No questions beyond the simple confirmation of identity. The prisoners stood quietly under the open sky while the paperwork continued. From where Carl stood, he could see more of the compound beyond the yard. Barracks stretched across the field in long rectangular rows with narrow paths running between them. Laundry hung on lines beside several of the buildings, white shirts moving gently in the breeze like small flags. A few prisoners walked between the structures carrying buckets or folded blankets, while an American guard leaned casually against the doorway of one barracks speaking with another soldier. The entire place felt strangely calm, almost routine, as if the war existed somewhere very far away. A sudden metallic clatter drew Carl's attention toward the far side of the yard where a kitchen building stood with its doors open to the morning air. Inside, he could see several men moving behind long counters where large steel pots rested on industrial stoves. Steam rose from one of the pots in a steady white column that carried a familiar smell across the yard. Bread. Fresh bread. The scent moved through the warm air slowly until it reached the line of newly arrived prisoners. Carl saw several men lift their heads at the same moment, their expressions shifting with quiet disbelief. One of the prisoners behind him whispered softly, almost to himself, "Is that for us?" Carl did not answer. He was still watching the kitchen doors where another worker carried a tray of something golden brown toward a nearby table. Whatever it was, it smelled warm and real and abundant in a way that felt almost impossible after months of wartime rations. The American officer finished checking the final names on his list and stepped back in front of the group. He looked at the prisoners for a long moment before speaking again in the same measured German. You are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. You will receive food, shelter, and medical care. You will work. You will follow the camp rules. If you do these things, you will have no trouble here. His tone was calm, almost matter of fact, as though he were explaining the routine of an ordinary workplace rather than the beginning of captivity. Carl listened carefully to every word. Around him the other prisoners stood silent, absorbing the same realization that had begun quietly forming inside his mind since the moment the ship reached the harbor. The place they had arrived was not what they had been taught to expect. And as the warm smell of bread drifted again through the open yard beneath the bright American sky, Carl Fisher understood that whatever came next would challenge everything he thought he knew about the enemy waiting on the other side of the ocean. The line of prisoners remained standing in the gravel yard while the morning continued to unfold around them with the quiet rhythm of a place that had repeated the same routine for months. Carl Fisher shifted his weight slightly from one foot to the other, the small stones beneath his boots crunching softly each time he moved. The sun had climbed higher now, warming the open yard and casting sharp shadows beneath the trucks and buildings. The smell from the kitchen drifted through the air again, stronger this time, carried by a gentle breeze that moved across the compound from the surrounding fields. Carl noticed how many of the men in line lifted their heads each time the scent returned, as if their bodies reacted before their thoughts had time to catch up. Hunger had a way of sharpening the senses. One of the American soldiers approached the group, carrying a stack of folded cloth uniforms over his arm. He stopped beside the officer with the clipboard and spoke quietly for a moment before stepping toward the prisoners. His movements were steady and deliberate, the way someone moved when performing a task he had completed many times before. When he reached the front of the line, he held out one of the folded garments and spoke slowly in careful German. You will receive clean clothing. You will change after medical inspection. The prisoner at the front accepted the uniform with a brief nod, clearly unsure what else to do. The soldier moved down the line one man at a time, handing each prisoner a similar set of clothing. When he reached Carl, he paused long enough to look directly at him before extending the bundle forward. The fabric felt heavier than Carl expected when he took it. It smelled faintly of soap and sunlight, the clean scent of something that had been washed and dried outdoors. Carl ran his thumb across the material for a moment before holding it against his chest. Clean clothing was not something he had expected to receive on the first day of captivity. A second American soldier stepped forward and gestured toward a nearby building with a wide doorway. Medical, he said, pointing clearly so that no translation was necessary. The prisoners began moving slowly in that direction, forming a loose line that stretched from the gravel yard to the entrance of the examination hall. Carl walked with the others, the folded uniform still tucked under his arm. The building looked simple from the outside, painted the same quiet white as the surrounding barracks. But inside it was cool and organized with long wooden tables and rows of metal chairs arranged along the walls. Several American medical staff members moved calmly through the room, checking paperwork and preparing equipment, while another interpreter stood near the doorway ready to explain instructions when needed. Carl waited his turn and watched the routine unfold. Each prisoner stepped forward when called, answered a few basic questions, and received a quick examination that seemed more practical than intimidating. Height was measured. Weight was recorded. A doctor listened to each man's breathing with a stethoscope that gleamed under the electric lights. The entire process moved efficiently without unnecessary delay. No one shouted. No one rushed. The room operated with the quiet precision of a train station timetable. When Carl finally reached the table at the front of the room, the doctor glanced up from his clipboard and offered a brief nod. He looked older than the soldiers outside, his hair already showing streaks of gray above the temples. Carl Fisher, the interpreter read from the paper beside him. Carl confirmed his name and stood still while the doctor measured his height against the wooden scale. 176 centimeters. The interpreter translated automatically into the American system as the doctor wrote the number in inches on the form. The scale shifted slightly as Carl stepped onto it next. The doctor adjusted the sliding weight across the metal bar and studied the number that appeared. 152 pounds, the interpreter said. The doctor nodded quietly and made another note before stepping back. The entire examination lasted less than 2 minutes. When Carl stepped away from the table, he felt strangely lighter, not because the process had been comfortable, but because it had been so ordinary. The prisoners were guided into another room where wooden benches lined the walls beside several metal lockers. One of the soldiers pointed toward the lockers and explained through the interpreter that the men would store their belongings before changing into the clean uniforms they had received outside. Carl placed his few personal items inside the locker and changed quickly, folding his old clothing the way he had been instructed. The new uniform fit well enough, slightly stiff from recent washing, but comfortable compared to the worn fabric he had traveled in. When the group finished dressing, they were led back outside into the sunlight. The gravel yard looked brighter now under the full morning sky, and the activity around the compound had increased. Several prisoners already assigned to the camp moved between the buildings carrying supplies or pushing small carts loaded with crates. A truck arrived near the storage building, and 2 American soldiers began unloading wooden boxes while a group of prisoners waited nearby to move the cargo inside. Everything seemed to follow a steady rhythm that required little supervision. Carl noticed again how relaxed the guards appeared as they moved through the compound. They watched carefully but without tension, as if the entire place operated on the understanding that cooperation made life easier for everyone involved. The newly arrived prisoners were gathered once more near the center of the yard, where another American officer stood waiting beside a table stacked with metal trays. As the group approached, the officer spoke briefly with the interpreter before addressing the line. "You will eat first," the interpreter explained. "After that you will receive your barracks assignments." The word seemed almost unreal to Carl for a moment. Food had been promised earlier, but hearing it stated so plainly created a ripple of quiet surprise among the prisoners. The officer lifted one of the trays from the table and handed it to the first man in line before pointing toward the kitchen building where the warm smell continued to drift through the open doors. The prisoners began moving forward one at a time. Carl watched the process carefully. Each tray was filled quickly by the kitchen staff inside before being passed along to the next man waiting at the entrance. When Carl finally stepped through the doorway, he saw the source of the scent that had filled the yard for the past hour. Long tables stretched across the room beneath bright overhead lights. Large metal pans rested along the serving counter, each one holding a different portion of the morning meal. Bread stacked in neat rows. Eggs cooked until their edges turned golden. Thick slices of potatoes steaming gently in the warm air. A kitchen worker placed each item onto Carl's tray with quiet efficiency before sliding it across the counter toward him. For a moment, Carl simply stood there looking down at the food, trying to absorb the reality of what he was seeing. The portions were generous. The bread looked fresh. Nothing about the meal suggested the thin rations he had prepared himself to accept. A guard standing nearby noticed the hesitation and spoke calmly in English, his tone friendly even though Carl understood only part of the words. The man gestured toward the tables and nodded once. The meaning was clear enough. Eat. Carl carried the tray toward one of the empty benches where the other prisoners were already sitting. As he lowered himself onto the wooden seat, he noticed something remarkable about the room. The conversation among the men was quiet but steady, not the tense whispering of frightened soldiers, but the normal sound of people eating after a long journey. For the first time since stepping onto American soil, Carl Fisher realized that the war had not followed him completely across the ocean. Inside this simple dining hall, beneath the bright lights and the smell of fresh bread, the world felt almost ordinary. The first bite of bread was the moment everything inside Carl Fisher hesitated. The crust cracked softly between his fingers when he broke it apart, and the warmth rising from the center carried a smell that felt almost impossible after months of rationed meals and cold field kitchens. For a second, he simply held the piece in his hand, watching the thin ribbon of steam rise and disappear into the bright air above the table. Around him, the other prisoners had already begun eating, but the room was strangely quiet, as if everyone understood that this moment required silence. Carl raised the bread slowly and tasted it. The flavor was simple: flour, yeast, salt. Yet the softness of it made him pause as he chewed. It was fresh. fresh bread in the middle of a prisoner camp thousands of miles from home. Across the table, a man named Otto Weber stared down at his tray in disbelief. Otto had been a mechanic before the war, a quiet man who spoke rarely during the long journey across the Atlantic. Now he held his fork motionless above the eggs on his plate. "Is this normal?" he asked quietly in German. No one answered right away. Carl glanced down at his own tray again. The portions were not extravagant, but they were generous enough to satisfy real hunger. 2 eggs cooked firm, but not dry. Potatoes sliced thick and browned lightly on the edges. Another piece of bread beside a small portion of butter wrapped in thin paper. Carl had prepared himself for something very different. Thin soup perhaps. A slice of stale bread. The kind of meal meant only to keep a prisoner standing. Instead, the tray in front of him looked like the breakfast served in a factory cafeteria back home before the war. Otto finally shook his head slowly. "If someone had told me this yesterday," he murmured, "I would have thought they were joking." Carl did not respond immediately. He was still tasting the bread, still trying to reconcile the reality of the food with the expectations that had traveled with him across the ocean. He had been told many things about captivity in America. None of those stories had included warm bread and eggs, served in a clean dining hall. Around the room, the quiet tension that had followed the prisoners since their arrival slowly began to loosen. The first sounds of normal conversation appeared like small ripples spreading across the tables. A man 2 benches away laughed softly at something another prisoner said. Someone else asked for salt in careful English. The kitchen workers moved steadily behind the serving counter, refilling trays for the next group, while the earlier arrivals finished their meals. Carl noticed that one of the American guards stood near the doorway with his arms folded loosely across his chest, watching the room with calm attention. He did not look threatening. He looked like a teacher supervising a classroom during lunch break. Carl took another bite, this time tasting the potatoes. The texture was crisp on the outside and soft in the center. Simple food. Honest food. The kind prepared to feed workers who needed energy for a full day of labor. Otto leaned forward slightly and lowered his voice. "Do you think this is just today?" he asked. "For the first day?" Carl considered the question carefully. It would have made sense. A gesture meant to create cooperation, a way to establish order among the prisoners before routines began. But something about the kitchen staff moving steadily behind the counter suggested otherwise. The efficiency looked practiced, not ceremonial. The trays were prepared with the rhythm of a system that had been running for months. "I do not think they would build a kitchen like this for one day," Carl said quietly. Otto nodded slowly and returned his attention to the food. At the far end of the dining hall, another group of prisoners from the convoy entered the room, carrying their trays. The line moved quickly as they searched for empty seats among the long wooden tables. Carl watched one of them sit down and immediately began eating with the focus of someone who had spent too many weeks wondering where the next meal might come from. The man closed his eyes briefly after the first bite, as if confirming the taste was real. The moment lasted only a second before he continued eating. Carl understood the reaction. Food had a way of reminding the body that survival was still possible. The guard near the door shifted his weight and spoke briefly with another soldier who had just stepped inside. Their conversation sounded casual, almost friendly. Carl caught a few English words he recognized. Weather, supplies, schedule. Ordinary words used in ordinary workplaces. The guard nodded once and walked slowly down the aisle between the tables, not interrupting anyone, simply observing. When he reached Carl's table, he paused for a moment. His eyes moved across the prisoners seated there before he spoke in slow, careful German that carried only a slight accent. "You will have time to finish," he said. "There is no hurry." The statement seemed almost unnecessary, yet the tone behind it felt genuine. Otto looked up from his tray with visible surprise. "Thank you," he said automatically. The guard gave a small nod and continued down the aisle. Carl watched him go, noticing the relaxed way the man carried himself. There was no tension in his shoulders, no sharp edge to his movements. The atmosphere inside the dining hall remained calm, as if everyone present had silently agreed that cooperation made the morning easier for all involved. Carl finished the last of the eggs and wiped the remaining piece of bread across the plate to gather the final traces of butter. The simple act felt strangely satisfying after the long uncertainty of the journey. When he leaned back slightly on the bench, he noticed something else about the room that had not been obvious at first. The windows along the far wall stood open, allowing fresh air to move slowly through the building. Outside, he could see the open yard where the trucks still rested under the sun, and beyond them the rows of barracks stretching across the field. A few prisoners already assigned to the camp crossed the yard carrying tools toward one of the storage buildings while a guard spoke with them near the doorway. Nothing about the scene suggested urgency or fear. It looked like the beginning of a normal workday. Otto finished his meal and sat quietly for a moment, staring down at the empty tray. Finally, he looked up at Carl again. "Do you remember what they told us about this place?" he asked. Carl nodded. He remembered the speeches clearly. America was supposed to be chaotic, cruel, incapable of discipline. A country too soft to manage prisoners properly and too arrogant to care about the consequences. Yet everything Carl had seen since stepping off the ship suggested a different reality entirely. Order, efficiency, food that was simple but honest, guards who treated the prisoners with calm professionalism instead of anger. Otto leaned back slightly on the bench and exhaled slowly. "Either we misunderstood everything," he said quietly, "or someone misunderstood America." Carl looked once more around the bright dining hall where the quiet sounds of breakfast continued beneath the warm morning light. For the first time since his capture, he allowed himself to consider a possibility that had seemed impossible only a day earlier. Perhaps the war had taught them less about their enemy than they believed. The dining hall slowly emptied as the first wave of prisoners finished their meals, the quiet clatter of trays and utensils fading into the background like the last notes of a song. Carl Fisher remained seated for a moment longer than most of the others, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the wooden table while he looked around the room. The warmth of the food still lingered in his stomach, a simple but powerful reminder that the journey across the Atlantic had finally ended. Outside the open windows, the late morning sun had climbed higher, and the light now spilled across the gravel yard in wide golden patches. A breeze moved through the room carrying the scent of grass and distant pine trees. For a prisoner of war camp, the air felt strangely peaceful. Otto Weber stood first, lifting his empty tray and glancing toward Carl. "We should go," he said quietly. Carl nodded and followed him toward the return counter near the kitchen doors where prisoners stacked their trays in neat rows before leaving the hall. The process was orderly and quick. One of the kitchen workers offered a brief nod of acknowledgement as Carl placed his tray down. There were no harsh instructions, no barking commands. Just the quiet routine of a place that expected cooperation. When Carl stepped back outside, the brightness of the yard momentarily forced him to narrow his eyes. The sunlight reflected sharply off the pale gravel and the white walls of the nearby barracks. The air felt warmer now, closer to the heavy warmth of late summer that settled across the American countryside in August. A group of newly arrived prisoners gathered near the same spot where the convoy had first stopped earlier that morning. Several American soldiers stood nearby, speaking with the interpreter while holding a small stack of papers. Carl and Otto joined the group without needing instructions. The pattern of the day was beginning to reveal itself step by step. First arrival, then medical inspection, then food. Now something else. The officer with the clipboard from earlier returned and addressed the group again through the interpreter. His voice carried clearly across the yard, but remained calm and measured. "You will now receive your barracks assignments," the interpreter explained. "Work details will be organized after you settle in." The officer began reading names from the list. Each prisoner stepped forward when called and received a small card bearing a number and the location of his barracks. The process moved quickly. Carl listened carefully as the names echoed one by one across the gravel yard. Some men were assigned to Barracks 3, others to Barracks 5. When Carl heard his own name, he stepped forward automatically. The officer handed him a small piece of paper marked with the number 7. The interpreter gestured toward a row of buildings farther across the compound. "Barracks 7 is there," he said. Carl glanced in the direction indicated. The building stood in the second row of barracks, identical in design to the others around it. Long, rectangular, painted white with narrow windows evenly spaced along both sides. Nothing about it looked intimidating. It looked almost like a rural schoolhouse. Otto received the same assignment a few names later. When he returned to Carl's side, he held up his card and gave a small shrug. "At least we will not be separated," he said. Carl nodded. Familiar faces were valuable in uncertain places. The group assigned to Barracks 7 began walking across the yard together, their footsteps creating a steady crunch on the gravel path. As they moved deeper into the compound, Carl noticed more details of daily life unfolding around them. Near one of the storage sheds, a pair of prisoners unloaded wooden crates from the back of a truck, while an American soldier checked the items against a list. Farther down the path, another group worked in a small vegetable garden enclosed by a low fence. Rows of tomatoes and beans grew in careful lines beneath the sun. The sight surprised Carl. A garden inside a prisoner camp suggested planning, patience, and time. As the men approached Barracks 7, the door stood open, allowing the cool shade of the interior to spill across the wooden steps. One of the American guards waited near the entrance. He looked younger than most of the soldiers Carl had seen so far, perhaps no older than 23. When the group reached the doorway, the guard gestured toward the interior and spoke in slow English before the interpreter translated. "Choose any bunk that is open," the interpreter said. "Keep the space clean. Personal items stay inside the lockers." Carl stepped inside with the others and paused for a moment just beyond the doorway. The inside of the barracks smelled faintly of clean wood and soap. 2 long rows of metal bunk beds stretched across the room from one end to the other, each bed neatly made with a thin mattress and folded blanket. At the foot of every bunk stood a small metal locker painted gray. Sunlight entered through the windows along the walls, casting long rectangles of light across the polished wooden floor. The room felt simple but organized, the kind of space designed to house many people efficiently without unnecessary decoration. Otto walked toward one of the lower bunks near the center of the room and dropped his small bundle of belongings onto the mattress. "This one is good," he said, testing the frame with a light push of his hand. Carl selected the bunk beside him and placed his locker card carefully on the shelf above the bed. Around them, the other prisoners began settling into their spaces, opening lockers and arranging their few personal items with quiet concentration. For men who had traveled across an ocean in uncertainty, even a simple bunk represented a form of stability. Carl sat down on the edge of the mattress and let his shoulders relax for the first time since the convoy had arrived at the camp. The room hummed softly with the small sounds of movement. A locker door closing, fabric rustling as someone folded clothing, a window sliding open another inch to let in more air. Otto leaned back against the metal frame of the bunk and looked toward the ceiling for a moment. "You know," he said slowly, "this place does not feel like the camps they warned us about." Carl understood exactly what he meant. The stories told during the war had described captivity as something brutal and chaotic, a place where prisoners were treated like burdens rather than human beings. Yet the morning at this camp had unfolded with calm order. Food had been served without hesitation. Medical staff had examined each man carefully, and now they had beds in a clean barracks beneath the quiet American sky. Carl rested his hands on his knees and listened to the breeze moving softly through the open windows. Somewhere outside, he could hear the faint sound of a tractor engine working in a distant field beyond the perimeter fence. The steady hum blended with the quiet sounds of the barracks until the entire moment felt almost peaceful. For the first time since leaving Europe, he allowed himself to believe that survival here might depend not on fear, but on understanding the unfamiliar world that surrounded them. The afternoon settled slowly over the camp like a warm blanket laid gently across the quiet rows of barracks. Inside Barracks 7, the men had begun to relax into the unfamiliar rhythm of their new surroundings. Carl Fisher sat on the edge of his bunk, his elbows resting lightly on his knees while he looked through the open window beside his bed. Outside, sunlight washed across the yard in long golden bands, and the faint sound of distant work drifted through the warm air. Somewhere near the far fence, a truck engine started and then faded again as it moved along the dirt road beyond the compound. The moment felt strangely calm. Otto Weber lay back on his bunk with his hands folded behind his head, staring at the ceiling beams that ran across the length of the room. "It is quiet here," he said after a moment. Carl nodded slightly. He had noticed the same thing. The camp did not echo with the sounds he expected from a place filled with prisoners and guards. Instead, there were small, ordinary noises. The creak of wooden floors, the distant rumble of a vehicle passing outside the gate, the faint laughter of a group of men somewhere across the yard. The entire place felt less like a prison and more like a carefully managed town where everyone understood their role. Across the room, one of the other prisoners opened his locker and began folding his clothing neatly onto the shelf inside. Another man sat on his bunk reading a small booklet that had been handed out earlier with the camp rules translated into German. Occasionally someone stood to adjust a window or step outside for fresh air. No one rushed. No one raised their voice. It was the quiet of men adjusting to a reality they had not expected. After several minutes, the barracks door opened, and the young American guard who had greeted them earlier stepped inside. The room fell silent almost immediately, not from fear, but from the natural instinct of soldiers when a superior enters the space. The guard looked around the room once, his expression calm and observant. In his hand, he carried a small clipboard with several sheets of paper attached. The interpreter followed him through the doorway and closed the door softly behind them. "Good afternoon," the interpreter began in clear German. "The guard will explain the work assignments for tomorrow." Several of the prisoners sat up straighter on their bunks, listening carefully. Carl did the same, leaning forward slightly, so he could hear every word. The guard spoke slowly in English while the interpreter translated each sentence into German. "The camp operates on a regular schedule," the interpreter said. "You will wake at 6 in the morning. Breakfast will be served shortly after. Work details begin at 7:30. The words were delivered without threat or emphasis, simply as practical information. The guard turned one page on the clipboard and continued. "Some prisoners will work inside the camp. Others will work on nearby farms or maintenance crews. The assignments depend on skills and physical condition." Otto raised an eyebrow and glanced toward Carl with quiet curiosity. Work outside the camp had not been mentioned during the journey. The interpreter continued. "The Geneva Convention requires that prisoners be paid for their labor. You will receive small wages that can be used at the camp canteen." A murmur moved through the room, not loud but noticeable. Several men exchanged brief glances. The idea of receiving payment as prisoners seemed almost impossible after everything they had been taught about captivity. The guard paused until the room settled again. Then he spoke a few more sentences before the interpreter translated. "If you follow the rules and complete your work assignments, life here will remain orderly. The goal of the camp is cooperation." Carl studied the guard carefully while the instructions continued. The young soldier's posture remained relaxed, his tone even and professional. There was no hint of hostility in the way he addressed the prisoners. He spoke as though explaining the expectations of a workplace rather than the rules of confinement. When the explanation ended, the interpreter folded the papers neatly and nodded once to the group. "You may rest for the remainder of the afternoon," he said. "Dinner will be served at 5:30. The guard gave a brief glance around the room before turning toward the door. Within seconds, both men stepped outside, and the door closed quietly behind them. For a moment, the barracks remained silent as the prisoners absorbed what they had just heard. Then Otto sat upright on his bunk and shook his head slowly. "Paid work," he said. "Did you ever imagine hearing that sentence?" Carl leaned back slightly against the metal frame of the bed. "No," he replied honestly. The war had prepared them for many things, but this was not one of them. Across the room, the man with the rule booklet lowered it and spoke for the first time. "I worked on a farm before the army," he said quietly. "If they assigned me to the fields, I would not complain." Another prisoner nodded. "Better than sitting behind fences all day." The conversation slowly spread across the room as the men considered the possibilities. Work meant movement, routine, perhaps even the chance to see more of the American countryside they had glimpsed during the drive from the harbor. Carl listened to the discussion while watching the sunlight shift across the wooden floor near the window. Outside, a breeze stirred the leaves of the trees beyond the fence, creating a soft, whispering sound that drifted into the barracks. The peaceful rhythm of the afternoon made it difficult to believe that only yesterday he had stood aboard a crowded ship expecting something far worse than this. Otto eventually rose from his bunk and stretched his arms above his head. "I think I will walk outside for a while," he said. Carl nodded and followed him toward the door. When they stepped back into the open air, the late afternoon sun hung lower in the sky, casting long shadows from the watchtowers across the yard. Several prisoners from other barracks sat on benches or walked slowly along the paths between buildings, enjoying the brief hours of rest before evening. Beyond the fence, Carl could see the distant fields where tractors moved slowly across the land beneath the wide American sky. The machines worked steadily, carving long lines through the soil while clouds drifted lazily above them. Otto stood beside him, and looked toward the horizon for a long moment. "It feels strange," he said finally, "standing here and watching farms while the war continues somewhere else." Carl understood the feeling. The war had once filled every hour of his life. Now it existed somewhere far beyond the quiet fences of this camp. He rested his hands on the wooden rail beside the path and listened to the distant hum of the tractors blending with the gentle wind across the fields. For the first time since arriving, he began to understand that captivity in this place might not be defined by fear alone. It might be shaped instead by the quiet discovery that the world beyond the war was still capable of ordinary kindness. The light began to soften as the afternoon moved slowly toward evening, and the long shadows of the watchtowers stretched farther across the gravel paths between the barracks. Carl Fisher and Otto Weber walked slowly along the narrow dirt path that ran beside the fence, their boots stirring. Small clouds of dust with each step. The air carried the warm scent of dry grass and pine trees from the woods beyond the perimeter, and somewhere in the distance a tractor engine continued its steady rhythm across the fields. The sound had become strangely comforting. It reminded Carl that life outside the camp continued in its ordinary pattern, untouched by the uncertainty that had defined the past several years of war. Otto rested his hands on the wooden rail of the fence and looked through the wire toward the farmland stretching across the horizon. The fields moved gently in the breeze, the rows of crops bending in slow waves beneath the fading sunlight. "If someone had shown me this view yesterday," Otto said quietly, "I would not have believed it." Carl nodded. The same thought had crossed his mind more than once since arriving. The America described during their military training had sounded like a dangerous and chaotic place, full of desperation and hostility toward enemy soldiers. Yet the landscape before them looked calm and orderly, the kind of countryside where farmers measured time by the seasons rather than by the sound of distant artillery. A small pickup truck moved along a dirt road beyond the fields, its tires raising a thin trail of dust behind it as it disappeared behind a row of trees. For a moment, both men watched the road until the truck vanished completely from sight. Nearby, another group of prisoners walked slowly along the path between the barracks, speaking quietly among themselves while enjoying the last warmth of the day. Some sat on wooden benches placed beneath the shade of the buildings. Others leaned against the walls, looking out toward the fields in the same thoughtful silence that Carl felt inside himself. The entire camp seemed to breathe more slowly in the late afternoon light. After a while, Otto stepped away from the fence and glanced toward the center of the compound where several prisoners had gathered around a small wooden table. One of the men held a deck of worn playing cards while the others watched with quiet interest. The simple scene felt almost surreal after the long months of uncertainty that had brought them here. "It looks like a village evening," Otto said. Carl allowed himself a faint smile at the observation. There was truth in it. The calm routine of the camp resembled the quiet end of a workday in a small town more than the harsh image of captivity they had expected. Carl and Otto walked back toward Barracks 7 as the sky slowly changed color above the compound. The bright blue of the afternoon faded into softer shades of orange and gold along the horizon. The watchtower guards shifted positions as the sun lowered, their silhouettes moving gently against the sky as they continued their quiet observation of the camp. None of the movements felt hurried or tense. The entire place operated with a kind of patient rhythm that seemed designed to keep the day moving forward without conflict. When Carl stepped back inside the barracks, he noticed that several of the men had already returned from their walks. A few sat on their bunks writing short notes in small notebooks, while others organized their lockers or simply rested on the thin mattresses. The air inside carried the faint scent of clean wood mixed with the warm breeze drifting through the open windows. Otto dropped onto his bunk and stretched his legs out in front of him with a long sigh. "For the first day of captivity," he said, "this has been the strangest day of my life." Carl sat down beside him and rested his hands on the edge of the bed frame. "Strange is a good word," he agreed quietly. After a few minutes, the barracks door opened again, and the same young American guard stepped inside, this time accompanied by the interpreter who had spoken earlier in the afternoon. The conversations around the room faded immediately as the men turned their attention toward the doorway. The guard carried a small lantern in one hand, even though the last of the sunlight still filtered through the windows. He placed it gently on a nearby table, and looked across the room to make sure everyone was listening. The interpreter stepped forward and began translating the instructions in calm, measured German. "Dinner will be served in 15 minutes, he said. "After the meal you will return here for the night. Lights will go out at 9:30. Several of the prisoners nodded quietly. The schedule felt simple and predictable, something that could be understood easily after the confusion of the journey across the ocean. The guard added a few more words in English, and the interpreter continued. "You are expected to keep your living area clean and to respect the camp rules. If there are medical concerns, you report them to the infirmary." When the explanation finished, the guard gave a brief nod and lifted the lantern again before stepping back toward the door. The interpreter followed him outside, and once again the barracks returned to its quiet rhythm. Otto sat up and rubbed his hands together slowly. "Dinner already," he said. The day moved quickly. Carl stood and looked through the window toward the dining hall across the yard where several lights had begun to glow in the early evening shadows. The smell of food drifted faintly through the air again, reminding the prisoners that the next part of the routine was about to begin. Around him, the men rose from their bunks and moved toward the door with calm efficiency. The earlier tension that had accompanied their arrival had almost completely faded. In its place was something quieter and more practical: curiosity. As Carl stepped outside once more, the evening sky stretched wide above the camp in soft shades of purple and orange. The last rays of sunlight touched the tops of the trees beyond the fence while the distant fields settled into the deep calm of approaching night. The war still existed somewhere across the ocean, but here inside the quiet perimeter of the camp, the first day of a very different life was coming gently to a close. The dining hall glowed with warm light as the prisoners from Barracks 7 entered in a slow and orderly line. Outside, the last colors of sunset were fading into a deep blue sky, and the watchtowers stood quietly against the horizon like silent silhouettes. Inside the hall the air was warmer than before, filled with the smell of cooked vegetables, bread, and something richer that Carl Fischer could not immediately identify. The same long wooden tables stretched across the room beneath the bright electric lamps, and the kitchen workers moved steadily behind the serving counter with the practiced rhythm of people who had prepared this meal many times before. Carl walked beside Otto Weber, both of them carrying the same calm curiosity that had followed them through the entire day. When Carl reached the serving counter, a kitchen worker placed a metal tray in front of him and began filling it quickly but carefully. There was a portion of roasted chicken, several spoonfuls of green beans, a serving of mashed potatoes with light brown gravy, and another piece of warm bread. The worker finished by placing a small cup of apple slices on the corner of the tray before sliding it forward. Carl paused for half a second, looking at the tray with quiet disbelief before lifting it and moving toward the nearest table. Otto followed him, his own tray nearly identical. The two men sat across from one another while other prisoners filled the benches nearby. For a moment Carl simply studied the meal again. The roasted chicken was browned lightly on the outside, the skin crisp in places where the heat had touched it longest. Steam rose slowly from the potatoes, carrying the smell of butter and pepper. None of the food looked extravagant, yet it felt generous compared with what he had expected when the ship first approached the American coast. Otto leaned forward slightly and lowered his voice. "This is the second time today," he said quietly. "Twice they have surprised us." Carl nodded as he lifted his fork and tasted the potatoes. They were smooth and warm, the gravy rich but simple. It was the kind of meal that reminded a man of home kitchens rather than military camps. Around the dining hall the same quiet realization moved from table to table as the prisoners began eating. The sound of forks against metal trays replaced the earlier murmur of conversation. Carl noticed that several of the American guards stood along the walls near the doors, watching the room with relaxed attention while speaking quietly among themselves. One of them carried a small notebook and occasionally wrote something down before returning it to his pocket. The atmosphere felt controlled but not tense. After several minutes, Otto broke the silence again. "Do you think they do this because they want cooperation?" he asked. Carl considered the question while chewing slowly. It was possible. A camp ran more smoothly when prisoners accepted the routine rather than resisted it. Yet the efficiency of the kitchen and the calm behavior of the guards suggested something deeper than a simple tactic. The entire place seemed built on a belief that order worked better than fear. Maybe Carl said at last. Or maybe this is simply how they run their camps. Otto nodded slowly but said nothing more. The conversation at the surrounding tables gradually returned as the first hunger of the meal began to fade. Some of the prisoners spoke quietly about the farms they had seen outside the fence earlier that afternoon. Others wondered about the work assignments mentioned by the guard. A man seated 2 benches away explained that he had been a carpenter before the war and hoped the camp might use those skills somewhere in the maintenance buildings. The tone of the room felt different from the tense whispers Carl remembered from the ship. The uncertainty was still there, but it had softened into cautious curiosity. Carl finished the last piece of chicken and leaned back slightly on the bench while he watched the movement of the room. The dining hall windows reflected the darkening sky outside, and the electric lamps above the tables hummed quietly as they cast bright circles of light across the wooden floor. The entire scene felt orderly, almost peaceful. It was difficult to imagine that only a few hours earlier he had stood in a harbor expecting something entirely different. Otto wiped the last of the gravy from his tray with a piece of bread and shook his head once more. Back home, he said quietly, they told us that America was chaotic, that they could not organize anything properly. Carl glanced around the dining hall again. The kitchen workers moved in smooth patterns behind the counter, stacking trays and refilling food containers with practiced efficiency. The guards maintained their positions without raising their voices. Even the prisoners themselves seemed to follow the routine naturally. This does not look chaotic, Carl replied. Otto gave a short laugh. No, it looks like a factory lunch break. When the men finished their meals, they carried their trays to the return counter, just as they had done earlier in the day. The process was simple and quick. Within minutes, the first wave of prisoners began leaving the dining hall and stepping into the cool evening air outside. Carl followed Otto through the doorway and paused on the wooden steps for a moment. The night had settled fully over the camp now, and the sky above the compound was filled with a wide blanket of stars. The lights from the watchtowers shone down across the gravel paths, creating bright circles that marked the edges of the yard. Beyond the fence, the countryside had grown quiet except for the distant sound of crickets moving through the tall grass. Otto stood beside him and looked up at the sky. I have not seen stars this clearly in a long time, he said. Carl understood what he meant. In Europe, the sky had often been filled with the distant glow of burning cities or the restless movement of aircraft passing overhead. Here the stars appeared calm and steady, scattered across the darkness like small lanterns. The prisoners from Barracks 7 walked slowly back toward their building, their footsteps crunching softly on the gravel path. No one hurried. The schedule of the camp had already begun to guide their movements. When Carl stepped inside the barracks, once more he noticed that the lantern placed earlier on the table now cast a warm yellow light across the room. Several men were already preparing for the night, folding clothing or writing short notes in their notebooks before the lights would be turned off. Otto sat down on his bunk and stretched his legs with a quiet sigh. Tomorrow we begin working, he said. Carl nodded as he sat on the edge of his own bed. Outside the windows, the night wind moved gently through the trees beyond the fence. The first full day of captivity in America had ended not with fear or chaos, but with a quiet routine that still felt almost impossible to believe. And as Carl listened to the calm sounds of the barracks settling into sleep, he realized that the greatest surprise of all might not be what they had seen when they first arrived, but what they were beginning to understand about the people who ran this place. The lantern inside Barracks 7 flickered softly as the night deepened outside the windows. Carl Fisher lay on his bunk with his hands folded behind his head, staring up at the wooden beams of the ceiling while the quiet sounds of the barracks slowly settled around him. Some of the men were already asleep, their breathing steady and slow after the long journey that had brought them across the Atlantic. Others shifted occasionally on their bunks or whispered a few last words before sleep finally claimed them as well. Outside, the distant chirping of crickets blended with the gentle rustle of wind moving through the trees beyond the fence. The sound was peaceful, almost unfamiliar after years of nights interrupted by alarms and distant explosions. Carl closed his eyes for a moment and tried to remember the last time he had heard a night like this. It had probably been before the war, before uniforms and long marches and the endless uncertainty of the front. A soft creak from the bunk beside him broke the silence. Otto Weber turned onto his side and looked across the narrow space between their beds. "Are you awake?" he whispered. Carl opened his eyes again and nodded slightly. "Yes." Otto was quiet for a moment before speaking again. Today felt like something from another world. Carl understood what he meant. Only 24 hours earlier, they had been prisoners aboard a crowded ship crossing an ocean, preparing themselves for the worst possibilities of captivity. Now they lay inside a clean wooden barracks beneath a calm American sky, their stomachs full and their bodies resting after a day that had brought more questions than answers. "It is difficult to understand," Carl said quietly. Otto exhaled slowly and turned onto his back again. "Maybe tomorrow will explain more." The lantern on the table near the door dimmed slightly as its fuel burned lower, casting longer shadows across the floorboards. Eventually, even the soft whispers in the room faded, and the barracks settled into complete silence. Carl allowed his eyes to close once more, and this time sleep came quickly. When morning arrived, it did so with the soft gray light of dawn slipping through the windows. Carl woke gradually as the room around him stirred to life. A few of the men were already sitting on the edges of their bunks, pulling on their boots, while others stretched their arms and rubbed the sleep from their eyes. Outside, the distant sound of a bell echoed faintly across the compound. It was not loud or harsh, just a simple signal that the new day had begun. Otto sat up beside him and looked toward the window where the pale morning sky was brightening slowly. 6 o'clock, he said quietly. Carl swung his legs over the side of the bunk and stood, feeling the cool wooden floor beneath his boots. The air inside the barracks carried the crisp freshness of early morning, and the open windows allowed the faint smell of grass and pine to drift inside from the fields beyond the fence. Within minutes, the men had gathered their things and stepped outside into the cool dawn air. The camp looked different in the early morning light. A thin mist hung low across the distant farmland, and the sun had not yet climbed above the tree line. The watchtowers were still visible as dark outlines against the pale sky, while the paths between the barracks slowly filled with prisoners moving toward the dining hall. Carl and Otto joined the quiet stream of men walking across the gravel yard. No one spoke loudly. The calm routine of the camp seemed to guide everyone naturally. When they entered the dining hall, the kitchen workers were already in motion behind the serving counter, preparing trays with the same practiced efficiency Carl had seen the day before. The smell of coffee drifted warmly through the room, mixing with the scent of freshly cooked oatmeal and toast. Carl picked up his tray and moved down the line while a worker placed a bowl of oatmeal, a slice of buttered toast, and a cup of coffee in front of him. The meal was simple but warm, and the coffee carried a rich aroma that filled the air above the tables. Otto sat across from him again, holding his cup carefully between both hands. "I almost forgot what real coffee tastes like," he said quietly before taking a sip. Carl tasted his own cup and nodded. The bitterness of the coffee felt strong but welcome after months of substitutes. Around them, the prisoners ate quietly, the room filled with the low murmur of voices and the gentle clink of spoons against metal bowls. The day's routine felt already familiar, even though it had only begun the previous morning. After breakfast, the prisoners returned their trays and gathered once more outside the dining hall, where several American guards waited beside a wooden board listing the work assignments for the day. The interpreter stood nearby ready to explain the instructions. Carl stepped closer to read the board as the names were announced. Some men were assigned to kitchen duty, others to maintenance crews repairing fences or cleaning storage buildings. Several groups would travel outside the camp to nearby farms where extra labor was needed during the harvest season. When Carl heard his name called, he stepped forward with Otto and several others. The interpreter glanced down at the paper and spoke clearly. "Farm detail," he said. "You will leave the camp shortly after 7:30. Otto looked at Carl with a hint of curiosity. "Looks like we will see those fields up close." Carl nodded slowly. Part of him felt uncertain about leaving the camp even for work, but another part felt curious about the world beyond the fence they had studied from a distance the day before. A small transport truck arrived near the gate a few minutes later. The guards supervising the detail gestured calmly for the prisoners to climb into the back. Carl stepped onto the truck bed and took a seat beside Otto as the engine started with a low rumble. The gate opened slowly, and for the first time since arriving, Carl found himself crossing the boundary of the camp and heading out into the quiet American countryside. As the truck rolled down the dirt road between the fields, Carl looked across the wide farmland stretching beneath the brightening morning sky. The crops moved gently in the breeze, and the distant barns and silos stood against the horizon like markers of a world that continued its daily rhythm regardless of the war happening across the ocean. Otto leaned slightly forward, resting his hands on the wooden rail of the truck bed. "Yesterday we arrived expecting one thing," he said quietly. "Today we begin learning something completely different." Carl watched the fields pass slowly beside the road and realized that the first real chapter of their new life as prisoners had just begun. The transport truck rolled steadily along the narrow dirt road as the morning sun climbed higher above the wide American countryside. Carl Fisher sat near the wooden side rail of the truck bed with Otto Weber beside him, both men watching the farmland stretch out in long green rows across the landscape. The early light touched the tops of the crops and turned the dew resting on the leaves into thousands of small points of brightness. The road curved gently between the fields, and every few minutes the truck passed a farmhouse or a red-painted barn standing quietly among clusters of tall trees. The entire scene felt calm and unhurried, so different from the broken roads and damaged villages Carl had seen during the war in Europe. The truck slowed as it approached a wooden gate at the edge of a large farm. A white farmhouse stood about 200 yards from the road with a wide porch facing the fields. A tall metal windmill turned slowly behind the house, its blades creaking softly in the light breeze. The guard driving the truck turned into the gravel path and guided the vehicle toward a large red barn where several farm workers were already waiting. When the truck stopped, the engine settled into silence and the quiet sounds of the countryside returned immediately. Birds called from the nearby trees, and somewhere in the distance another tractor moved steadily across a neighboring field. The guard climbed out of the truck and walked toward the group of prisoners with calm confidence. The interpreter who had accompanied them from the camp stepped forward as well. "You will help with the harvest today," he explained in clear German. "The farmer will show you what to do." Carl and Otto climbed down from the truck along with the other men. Their boots touched the packed earth of the farmyard, and for the first time since leaving the camp, they stood fully outside the wire fences that had marked the boundary of their captivity. The air smelled of soil, grass, and the faint sweetness of crops ready for harvest. A tall American farmer approached them from the direction of the barn. He wore a wide straw hat and a faded blue work shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. His hands were rough from years of labor, but his expression was calm and practical as he studied the group in front of him. The interpreter spoke briefly with him before turning back to the prisoners. "You will pick beans in the south field," he said. "The work is simple. Follow the rows and place the beans in the wooden crates." The farmer gestured toward the field beyond the barn, where long rows of green plants stretched across several acres of land. Wooden baskets and crates were stacked neatly near the edge of the field, ready for the day's work. Carl walked with the others toward the rows while the morning sun warmed the ground beneath their boots. When he reached the edge of the field, he knelt beside the first row of plants and examined the beans hanging from the vines. The work looked straightforward. Twist the stem gently. Drop the beans into the basket. Move to the next. Plant. Within minutes the group spread out along the rows, and the quiet rhythm of harvesting began. The sound of leaves brushing against sleeves and the soft thud of beans dropping into baskets filled the air. Otto worked beside Carl, moving steadily down the row while the farmer walked occasionally between the workers, checking the crates and offering short instructions through the interpreter when necessary. There was no shouting and no pressure beyond the simple expectation that the work be done properly. The sun climbed higher through the morning, and the warm light settled across the fields in broad golden bands. Carl worked steadily, filling one basket after another while listening to the quiet sounds of the farm around him. A tractor passed slowly along the far edge of the field, pulling a wagon loaded with wooden crates. The driver lifted a hand in greeting as he passed, a small gesture that surprised Carl even more than the calm atmosphere of the camp itself. During a short break, near mid-morning the prisoners gathered beside the wagon where a large metal container held cool drinking water. Each man filled a tin cup and drank deeply while resting in the shade of the barn. Otto leaned against the wooden wall and wiped the sweat from his forehead. "This is real work," he said with a faint smile. "But it feels different from military labor." Carl nodded. The difference was clear. This work served a purpose that everyone understood. The The beans would be harvested. The crates would be loaded. The farm would continue its cycle of planting and gathering just as it had long before the war began. When the break ended, the prisoners returned to the rows and continued the harvest under the bright late morning sky. By midday, several crates were already filled and stacked neatly beside the wagon. The farmer inspected the rows and gave a satisfied nod before speaking briefly with the guard. The interpreter translated the message to the prisoners. "Lunch soon," he said. The word spread quietly through the group, and the men continued working with renewed energy as the final rows of the section were cleared. When the sun reached its highest point, the farmer signaled for the workers to gather near the shade of the barn once again. Several wooden boxes had been opened on a small table nearby. Inside were sandwiches wrapped in paper, along with fresh apples from the orchard behind the farmhouse. The simplicity of the meal did not hide the generosity behind it. Each prisoner received a sandwich and a piece of fruit along with another cup of cool water. Carl sat on the grass beside Otto while they ate beneath the shade of the windmill tower. The slow-turning blades above them creaked gently in the breeze. Across the field, the filled crates stood ready for transport to the barn where the harvest would be stored. Otto finished his apple and tossed the core into the tall grass before looking across the farmland that stretched toward the horizon. "When we first arrived," he said quietly, "I thought this place would feel like a prison every moment of the day." Carl followed his gaze across the rows of crops and the distant farmhouse resting beneath the wide American sky. The quiet rhythm of the farm continued around them, steady and unhurried. Instead, Otto continued, "It feels like we are witnessing a part of this country that we were never meant to see." Carl did not answer immediately. He watched the wind move gently through the field, bending the rows of plants in slow waves beneath the afternoon sun. The war had brought them across an ocean as enemies. Yet here in the middle of a quiet American farm, the work of the day felt surprisingly close to the ordinary life they had once known before the world changed. And for the first time since leaving the camp that morning, Carl realized that the greatest lesson of this place might not come from the fences or the guards, but from the quiet way everyday life continued even during the darkest years of war. The lunch break ended slowly as the afternoon sun settled high above the wide fields. Carl Fisher stood and brushed the dust from his trousers while the other prisoners finished their apples and gathered the empty paper wrappers from the grass. The farmer closed the wooden box that had held the sandwiches and gave a small nod toward the rows of crops still waiting in the field. The message did not require translation. The work would continue. Carl and Otto Weber walked back toward the long green rows, their boots pressing lightly into the warm soil as the steady rhythm of the harvest resumed. The afternoon air carried a deeper warmth now, and the scent of earth and plants rose from the ground beneath the sun. Carl bent again beside the vines and resumed the quiet motion that had already become familiar. Twist the stem, drop the beans into the basket, move forward along the row. The work was simple but steady, and the hours passed with the calm patience that only farm labor could create. A few clouds drifted slowly across the sky, offering brief patches of shade before the sunlight returned again. Somewhere beyond the barn, a dog barked once and then settled back into silence. Otto worked a few steps ahead of Carl, his basket filling gradually as he moved along the row. After a while, he glanced back over his shoulder. "You know," he said quietly, "if someone from home could see us now, they would never believe this." Carl understood exactly what he meant. Prisoners of war harvesting vegetables on an American farm beneath a peaceful sky was not the image anyone had described during their years of training. Back then, the stories had been filled with warnings about cruel guards and endless hardship. Yet the reality unfolding in the field looked very different. It looked like ordinary work. By mid-afternoon, the crates beside the wagon had doubled in number. The farmer moved between the rows occasionally, checking the baskets and lifting the filled crates onto the wagon where they would be taken to the barn for storage. Each time he passed the workers, he gave a brief nod of acknowledgement, a simple gesture that felt closer to cooperation than command. The guard who had accompanied the prisoners from the camp remained near the edge of the field, watching quietly while leaning against the wooden side of the wagon. His posture stayed relaxed, and more than once Carl noticed him studying the horizon rather than the workers themselves. The quiet trust within the arrangement was something Carl continued to notice throughout the day. No one attempted to run. No one argued about the work. The task itself seemed to create its own order. As the afternoon slowly approached evening, the heat softened, and a cool breeze began to move through the rows of plants. The leaves rustled gently against each other like distant whispers. Carl straightened his back for a moment and looked across the wide field they had nearly finished harvesting. The rows behind them were already clear, and the crates stacked on the wagon stood ready for the final trip to the barn. Otto stepped beside him and wiped his hands on a cloth he carried in his pocket. "Almost done," he said. The farmer approached a few minutes later and spoke briefly with the guard. The interpreter who had accompanied the group all day nodded and turned toward the prisoners. "That is enough for today," he announced in German. A quiet sense of relief moved through the group, though no one complained about the work they had done. Instead, the men gathered their baskets and walked back toward the wagon where the filled crates were already secured for transport. The farmer thanked them through the interpreter with a short, sincere message before climbing onto his tractor to finish moving the harvest inside the barn. Carl watched the machine rumble slowly across the yard as the prisoners returned to the truck waiting near the gate. The late afternoon sun had begun to lower toward the horizon, casting long golden lines across the fields that stretched in every direction. When the truck engine started again, the familiar rumble echoed softly across the quiet farmyard. Carl climbed into the back beside Otto as the vehicle turned onto the dirt road leading away from the farm. The ride back toward the camp felt different from the morning journey. The men were tired now in the honest way that followed a full day of physical work. Yet there was a quiet satisfaction in the way they leaned against the wooden rails of the truck while watching the countryside pass by. Otto looked across the fields as the road curved between two rows of tall trees. "Do you notice something strange?" he asked. Carl turned toward him. "What do you mean?" Otto nodded toward the distant barns and houses scattered across the farmland. "All day we worked beside the road," he said. "Any one of us could have walked away into those fields." Carl considered the thought for a moment while the truck rolled forward through the golden evening light. It was true. The rows of crops and open land had stretched for miles in every direction. There had been no walls or fences surrounding the farm. Yet none of the prisoners had tried to leave. "Where would we go?" Carl finally replied. Otto gave a small shrug. "Exactly." The truck passed another farmhouse where a family stood near the front porch watching the vehicle drive by. A young boy lifted his hand and waved as the prisoners passed. The gesture felt so ordinary that Carl almost smiled. The road eventually curved back toward the camp where the tall watchtowers appeared once again against the evening sky. The gates opened as the truck approached, and the vehicle rolled slowly into the gravel yard where the routine of the camp continued just as it had the day before. When Carl stepped down from the truck, his boots touched the familiar ground inside the compound. The warm glow of the setting sun illuminated the rows of barracks and the open yard between them. For a moment he stood still, listening to the quiet sounds of the camp settling into evening. Otto stepped beside him and stretched his arms after the long day in the fields. "Strange," he said softly. "After everything we saw today, coming back here almost feels like returning home." Carl looked across the yard where prisoners were already walking toward the dining hall for the evening meal. The routine of the camp continued calmly beneath the fading light. And as the sky above the compound slowly turned from gold to deep blue, Carl realized that the day had given him something he had not expected when the ship first reached American shores. Not comfort, not freedom, but understanding. A quiet realization that the world beyond the war was far more complicated and far more human than the stories they had once believed. The evening settled gently over the camp as Carl Fisher and the other prisoners walked across the gravel yard toward the dining hall once again. The sky above had turned deep blue, and the first stars had begun to appear beyond the dark outlines of the watchtowers. The warm glow of electric lights spilled from the windows of the dining hall, and the familiar smell of dinner drifted through the cooling air. Carl felt the quiet weight of the day in his muscles as he stepped inside beside Otto Weber. The long wooden tables were already filling with men returning from different work details around the camp. Some had spent the day repairing fences. Others had cleaned storage buildings or worked in the camp kitchen. The conversations around the room carried a different tone now than they had the previous evening. The uncertainty that had followed their arrival had begun to fade, replaced by the steady rhythm of routine. Carl collected his tray and moved through the serving line while the kitchen workers placed portions of stew, bread, and boiled vegetables onto the metal surface. The food was simple but warm, and the smell of the stew filled the room with a comforting richness. Carl and Otto sat at the same table they had used the night before. For a few minutes they ate in silence, letting the quiet sounds of the dining hall surround them. Finally Otto leaned back slightly and looked across the room. "Yesterday, I thought this place would be impossible to understand," he said. "Today it makes a little more sense." Carl glanced toward the windows where the dark countryside stretched beyond the fence. "How so?" Otto rested his arms on the table and spoke quietly. "This camp runs on the same idea as the farms we saw today. Everyone has a role. Everyone does the work that keeps the place moving." Carl considered the thought while taking another spoonful of stew. The comparison felt accurate. The farm had functioned through cooperation and steady effort, and the camp followed a similar pattern. Guards, workers, cooks, and prisoners all moved through the day with a purpose that seemed designed to prevent chaos before it ever began. When the meal ended, the prisoners returned their trays and stepped back outside into the cool evening air. The compound had grown quieter now. A few men walked slowly along the gravel paths while others returned directly to their barracks to rest after the long day of work. Carl and Otto walked together toward Barracks 7 beneath the dim lights mounted along the buildings. The lantern inside the barracks had already been lit, casting a warm glow across the wooden floor. Several prisoners were writing letters at the small table near the window. Others sat quietly on their bunks, speaking in low voices about the farms they had visited or the jobs they had been assigned inside the camp. Carl sat on the edge of his bunk and loosened the laces of his boots while the room settled gradually into the calm routine of the evening. Otto lay back on his bunk and looked toward the ceiling for a moment before turning his head toward. "Carl, do you remember the first thing you thought when the ship reached America?" he asked. Carl paused while removing his boots and thought back to that moment. The crowded deck, the harbor skyline, the tension in the air as every prisoner waited to see what would happen next. "Yes," Carl said quietly. "I expected something harsh." Otto nodded slowly. "We all did." For a moment neither of them spoke. Outside the open window the night wind moved through the trees beyond the fence, creating a soft rustling sound that drifted through the barracks. The distant chirping of insects filled the silence between their words. Finally Otto spoke again. "Instead we found something else entirely." Carl leaned back slightly against the wall beside his bunk and looked toward the window where the stars were beginning to brighten in the dark sky. "We found people who continued living their lives," he said, "even while the war continues somewhere else." The thought lingered in the quiet room. The farmers working their fields, the kitchen staff preparing meals, the guards maintaining the order of the camp without anger or cruelty. Each part of the system reflected a world that had not been defined entirely by conflict. After a while the young guard who supervised Barracks 7 stepped inside, carrying the same lantern used the night before. He placed it carefully on the table and spoke briefly with the interpreter who followed him through the door. The interpreter looked around the room and addressed the prisoners in calm German. "Lights will go out soon," he said. "Tomorrow the work details will continue as scheduled." The message was simple, but by now it felt familiar. The routine of the camp had already begun to shape the rhythm of their days. When the guard and interpreter left the barracks, the men began preparing for sleep. Lockers closed quietly. Boots were placed neatly beside the bunks. The lantern's flame dimmed slightly as the minutes passed. Carl lay down on his bunk and folded his hands behind his head while the soft sounds of the room gradually faded. Through the window he could see the stars stretching across the wide American sky, clearer than he had seen in years. The war that had brought him here still existed somewhere across the ocean. Cities were still fighting. Armies were still moving. Yet inside this quiet camp another reality had begun to take shape. A place where enemies worked side by side in fields, where meals were shared across long wooden tables, and where ordinary routines slowly replaced fear with understanding. Carl closed his eyes and listened to the gentle wind moving through the trees beyond the fence. The journey that had begun with uncertainty on the deck of a crowded ship had led him to something unexpected. Not freedom, and not the end of war, but a quiet lesson about the world beyond the stories men told during conflict. And as sleep slowly claimed the barracks beneath the calm American night, Carl Fisher understood something that would stay with him long after the war finally ended. Sometimes the greatest shock of all was discovering that the enemy had never been as simple as the war had made them appear.